probably a bit daft recording it now until everybody's with us, but I'll just pause the record for now. So I'm recording this, and what I'll do is I'll send it to Andreas for you. Okay. So I'm just trying to, there we are. What I'm going to do is I'm going to share my presentation now with you. Now I've just gotten another window. So really this is based upon the paper that I wrote, and in my view, Gregory Bateson was probably way ahead of many thinkers in his thinking around ecology. And I think from a philosophical point of view, he was probably way ahead of people who are following in his footsteps. Yes.
Sorry for interrupting. Could you just tell us who you are?
Yeah, I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry. Yes, I'm Hugh Palmer, and I'm a systemic psychotherapist or family therapist in the UK. And I have a particular interest in the work of Gregory Bateson and his what was called a cybernetic epistemology, what I would call systemic thinking. And I'm currently registered. I'm doing a PhD by publication, which is really around this work. So yeah, that's who I am. Oh, I've just got that 3 people entered. I've just got some more people to admit. I do apologize. Right. I just got a notification. So there's more. Welcome to everyone that's just joining us. Right. So there's a lot of text on here, but what I'm going to do is I will send this to Andreas to share with you all. So don't worry about writing everything down. So there's a lot of quotes on here, and I'll just read them out and explain a little bit about the context. Just to let you know, this photograph is it's a local spot near where I live. It's a little place called Givendale, and just near where I've taken the photograph is a little Norman church. It's tiny. It was built over 1,000 years ago, I would imagine. But also where the white snowdrops are growing is where my mother's ashes are scattered. So it's a very important place to me, and it's a place where I go for peace and quiet and to reflect. But Bateson wrote back in the 70s, there is an ecology of bad ideas, just as there is an ecology of weeds. When you narrow down your epistemology and act on the premise, what interests me is me, or my organization, or my species, you chop off consideration of other loops or the loop structure. You decide that what you want to get rid of, you decide that you want to get rid of the byproducts of human life, and that Lake Erie will be a good place to put them. You forget that the eco-mental system called Lake Erie is part of your wider eco-mental system, and that if Lake Erie is driven insane, its insanity is incorporated in the larger system of your thought and experience. Now, I think what Bateson's saying here is that his epistemology is non-dualistic, it's monistic, and unfortunately we tend to chop things up to make them understandable. So we talk about a family as a system, a community as a system, but in reality there are no systems. there is just everything. And the systems that we really are just constructs. So literally everything is connected. And when we start to pollute, what we're doing is we're driving, for example, Lake Erie, which was very badly polluted when Bateson wrote. They tried to clean it up, but it's still polluted because of agricultural runoff. If you drive the lake crazy, it's part of our wider ecology too, and therefore the insanity of that pollution becomes part of our own insanity. And I think that as a profession, systemic therapists, particularly in the UK, I think, which is ironic given that Bateson was originally from the UK, I think that as a professional, systemic therapists have really ignored a lot of what Bateson has had to say. And I think that, you know, that chopping off bits and just to focus on what we want is, sorry, I've just admitted somebody else to the meeting. We've chopped off the bits that interest us. So as family therapists, we're interested in a family system. And a lot of family therapists think systemically when they're in the clinic. They think about the family systemically, but then they leave the clinic and they get in their car and off they go and they live their lives, and not necessarily thinking about some of the other ideas that are actually integral to thinking systemically. Another quote from Bateson here, and this is from a book edited by Rodney Donaldson, whose PhD was really around putting together an alternative set of papers to Steps of an Ecology of Mind. And actually, Sacred Unity contains some really important writing of Bateson's. And one of the things that Bateson said here was, theory is becoming available to action-oriented people whose first impulse is that which is primarily in empiricism. Take it on the wards and try it. Don't waste years trying to understand the theory, just use whatever hunches seem to follow from it. And Bateson goes on to warn, such people are likely to be frustrated and their patients hurt. Theory is not just another gadget which can be used without understanding. And I think what Bateson was particularly referring to at this point was how the double-blind theory of schizophrenia was adopted by clinicians at the time, who ultimately, it led to blaming parents for young people having schizophrenia, particularly mothers. And Bateson was really clear when, around the time of the publication of the double-blind theory, that it was a theory, it was theoretical. And what happened was that people took those ideas and said, this is how schizophrenia is caused. It's caused by double-binding parents. And of course, life is far more complex than that. Double-binding parents don't just drop out of the sky, do they? If we think about trauma and how trauma is handed down from generation to generation, that people that are traumatized parents will inevitably pass some of that trauma on in one way or another to their children, and their children may develop symptoms of mental health, including psychosis. So Bateson was actually quite upset about how some of his ideas were taken. But the other issue here is that we didn't take on board other ideas of Bateson that were really important. So back to Bateson. Again, all these photographs are pictures that I've taken. It's a bit of a sort of vanity thing on my part. This is called wild garlic, the plant that you can see growing here in the trees, and it grows abundantly in the spring here, and it's really nice mixed with butter too. Anyway, back to Bateson. The basic rule of systems theory is that if you want to understand some phenomenon or appearance, you must consider that phenomenon with the context of all completed circuits which are relevant to it. Thinking this way might even lead the human race to a sort of wisdom that would preclude the wanton destruction of our biological environment and preclude some of the very peculiar attitudes we exhibit towards patients, foreigners, minorities, our spouses, and our children, and even each other. Now, what Bateson is really saying here is that we need to really get away from any kind of dualistic thinking. Because as soon as we separate and make something an other, we set ourselves against it in ways. So when we think about a family that we're working with, or we're thinking about our own family, we have to think of the whole context of all their lives and all our lives, which is really hard to do. But really what Bateson is saying is if we begin to change the way we think, it's going to change the way we are in the world. It's going to change the way we treat the environment, the way we treat other people. And I can't really express how strongly I believe this is true, and how urgent it is that we change our thinking, because thinking ecologically, thinking systemically isn't just something to do in the clinic. It's how we live our lives. And how we work in the clinic is part of it. So if we're thinking specifically about ecology and ecological ideas, the early use of the term ecosystemic in family therapy contexts was thinking about the context of an individual within their family. So we'd be thinking about ecosystemically, we'd be thinking about Andreas and his partner and his dog, and that would have been the Andreas's ecology. Not thinking about the mountains, not thinking about the community in which he lived. And of course, that was again part of the problem with early family therapists, were just thinking about ecology in terms of a family. And you know, other writers sort of say, you know, ecosystemics is concerned with human autonomous systems. Well, no, I'm sorry, it's not. It's concerned with the environment. It's concerned with everything, not just human systems. Again, the one person that I think really had a good grasp of what Bateson was saying was Auswald, who was writing at the same time, really, that Bateson was. Auswald really seemed to understand what Bateson was saying. And he said the ecological systems approach ensures that the entire process of planning for a community is rooted in the realities and needs of that community. So Auswald was thinking about the wider community. And then in the quote at the bottom here, he went on to say, I believe that Bateson, by dipping into our field, provided a conceptual link between the thinking of family therapists and the epistemology of a new science. What emerged in our thought has acquired the label of the ecosystemic epistemology. And I think that we missed something. We missed a chance, because Bateson offered us as systemic thinkers the opportunity to embrace this new way of thinking and not just apply it to the clinic. Brad Keeney who is still quite active. I think he was one of the very early sort of people that wrote, I think, a really brilliant book on Bateson and therapy called Aesthetics of Change. But he said ecosystemic epistemology can now be defined for diagnosis as a way of knowing problematic situations through the epistemological framework or paradigm representing cybernetics, ecology, and systems theory. But even then, at the time, I think that very much the thinking ecologically was still very much thinking more about the family system and the ecology of the family, rather than thinking about the wider issues regarding ecology. So, in summary, the ecosystemic perspective in family therapy represented a shift from an anti-contextual and reductionistic epistemology concerned with objectivity and truth to a worldview that encompasses complexity, contextual patterns of relationship, and multiple realities, which was pretty revolutionary. You know, that was important. However, you know, and I would say that that is more than just another gadget. And as a shift, because really it was about the shift to second order thinking. However, there's little evidence that early family therapists considered wider ecological aspects of responsibility or practice, despite Bateson's insistence that humanity's conscious purpose was setting us at odds with the very ecology that we're part of. And I guess the issue is that if we don't actively work to change the way we are treating the environment and the climate, we won't have a job, because there won't be families to provide care for. Now, I've got 3 grandchildren, a 4-year-old and twin girls who are 2 years old. And I worry about the future that they're inheriting from our generations. So I was kind of interested in the people that really seem to be following in Bateson's footsteps tend to be feminist thinkers on the whole. And there's an English scholar, Val Featherstone, who was actually an educationalist, not a therapist, who wrote, "In a feminist ideological framework, life is an evolving process and is seen in multidimensional terms. Thus, there is no grand cure or final fix for presenting problems. Therefore, it is considered that yet another paradigm shift could take place within family therapy, a feminist, ecosystemic, or ecological perspective, and way of thinking being a preferable model when helping families, particularly independent families." Now, I think what Featherstone said there in '96 was way ahead of what other people were writing. And it's interesting that it was somebody that was not a family therapist herself who wrote this. But now there are sort of more current thinkers, Karen Barad, who writes about materiality, Donna Haraway, I think it's Rosie Braidotti, I think I've spelled her name wrong there, and Anna Singh are all showing us routes to follow in Bateson's footsteps. But in fact, those authors are actually very much influenced by Deleuze and Guattari, who in their turn were very much influenced by Bateson, although they didn't acknowledge how much of an influence Bateson was, and they were quite dismissive of Bateson, were Deleuze and Guattari. They said he had an American career. They were quite dismissive of him. But these current thinkers are what I suppose we would call post-humanists. So the next stage, I suppose, we've had constructivism, social constructionism, and I think the next kind of broad way of thinking is post-humanism, and that is about decentering humans. Social constructionism centers humans, that meaning and realities are constructed in relationship between humans. Transhumanism says, well, hang on, what about other entities, other creatures? What about mountains? What about forests? What about reindeer? You know, we don't include them as having agency, as being as important as human beings. So we're seeing, which is pretty much what Bateson was saying. So Bateson really predated the post-human turn, and perhaps isn't acknowledged as much as he could have been by some of these authors. So is Bateson still relevant? That's my grandson looking at infinity. I would argue, yes, Bateson is still relevant. Bateson's call to us wasn't to simply think about the systems of the people we serve and the context of their lives. He was asking us to think systemically about ourselves, our own lives and responsibilities to us, to each other, to our environment, for we too are part of the whole. As Karen Barad says, we are responsible for the world of which we are a part, not just because it's an arbitrary construction of our choosing, but because reality is sedimented out of particular practices that we have a role in shaping and through which we are shaped. And I don't know, I think it was Gandhi who said, be the change that you want to see. And if we want to be the change that we want to see, the only way that we're going to survive is to change the way we think. And we're desperately short of time. So to move on a little bit more, Bateson here, some lichen and a dandelion clock. It was my experiment with macro photography. But of course, you're probably very familiar with lichens in Norway. Kind of important. It's a real indicator of clean air. So more Bateson. It's not a new idea that living things have an immanent beauty, but it is revolutionary to assert as a scientist that matters of beauty are really highly formal, very real, and crucial to the entire political and ethical system in which we live. So it's kind of thinking that beauty and the sacred are actually crucial to living in an ethical, sustainable world. And I'll explain that a little bit more with this. I can't remember, I think it was Wordsworth, who, I could be wrong, quoted here, or Browning, a primrose by a river's brim, a yellow primrose was to him, and it was nothing more. So it's just a flower. So if you see a primrose and it is something more aesthetically, then I suspect that the primrose contains formal characteristics of symmetry, imperfect symmetry, complex interwoven patterning, and so forth, which indicate that the primrose itself is a mentally governed piece of morphogenesis, and that the aesthetic thing is a recognition of that, for better or worse, for beauty or ugliness. So it's Bateson's asking us to look at the world, to notice symmetry, complexity, interconnections, and I suppose to see the beauty is to be in awe of something, to be humble and to be respectful. because part of the problem, Bateson sort of identified that there were three drivers towards our extinction: population increase, technology, and the way we think. And realistically, without sort of eugenics, which seems to be happening with COVID, but realistically, ethically, the only way that we can address the crisis that we're facing is to change the way we think. And the two prime elements of the problem with the way we think are dualism, that we split things up, and hubris, arrogance, our short-term thinking, our lack of conscious purpose. We want to get things done. We want to, we want cheap fuel. We want, we want nice phones or what have you, without thinking about the long-term consequences of the decisions we make. There's no humility in our connection with the world. And we're living in what Anand Singh, the post-humanist writer, describes as precarious, troubling times. Bateson was right to be concerned about the precariousness of our situation and our hopes of survival. And Anand Singh says, precarity is the condition of being vulnerable to others. Unpredictable encounters transform us. We are not in control, even of ourselves. Unable to rely on a stable structure of community, we are thrown into shifting assemblages which remake us as well as our others. We can't rely on the status quo. Everything is in flux, including our ability to survive. And I would say, I mean, Anand Singh wrote that 7 years ago. I would say that the situation is even more precarious now. The IPCC report has just come out, part 4, and it's basically saying, our addiction to fossil fuels is killing us, and how that's enacted out with what's happening in Ukraine at the moment. Underneath all this, it is also our need for fossil fuels, for gas, for oil. And I suspect that in Norway that you've probably dealt with things a little bit more sensibly than other countries, but still. The problem is that you might have one country does things properly, does things sensibly, but if other countries don't, it doesn't make any difference. If we look at COVID, in New Zealand, they learned from their neighbours in the Pacific where they'd had SARS outbreaks before. And in New Zealand, they went for a zero COVID strategy. And it worked for a long time. But because so many other countries didn't adopt a zero COVID strategy, if everyone had done, COVID would be gone now. But because of short-term thinking, unfortunately, it didn't matter what New Zealand did. And what I'm saying is that in some ways, Norway could be the most ecologically amazing place where you look after the environment and you manage the economy to take into account everybody else and all the citizens. But if other countries aren't doing the same, eventually the same problems will impact on Norway, because no country is isolated. So that if the rest of the planet messes up the environment and the ecology, it doesn't matter how good you are in Norway or how good they are in New Zealand, it won't make any difference in the long term. So going back to ecology in therapy, I would say that we are maybe rediscovering the relevance of Bateson's cybernetic epistemology. And given that our discipline, and those of you that are trained family therapists, you've got the benefit of being able to think and act systemically. We are actually ideally positioned to make trouble, as Donna Haraway says in the quote later on, to challenge the individualization of distress created by structural violence, brought about by capitalism, patriarchy, necropolitics, and colonialism, to challenge colonization, racism, sexism, and the othering of our kin, both human and otherwise, mountains and lions, trees, and even manufactured items. So as Donna Haraway says, our task is to make trouble, to stir up potent response to devastating events, as well as to settle troubled waters and rebuild quiet places. And that is a challenge for all of us. And one writer who I've got a fair bit of respect for, Tracy Laszloffli, she's an American family therapist who's probably the only person who's really, apart from Oswald, who's written about ecology and family therapy. And she said, the concept of isomorphism, which, you know, it's like, you know, how you know, my grandson here is isomorphic to me, with the same shape, just different sizes. The concept of isomorphism suggests that it's important for therapists to model the change they wish to see in their systems. As therapists, we are committed to promoting healing and transformation in the lives of our clients. But that means we are ideally also a part of healing and transforming the world within which we all exist. And there's a few references there. I'll stop that. So that's my presentation, and now it's kind of back to you in your offices and spaces. Ask questions, make comments, criticize, admire. I don't care. I mean, I'm just curious to know what your thoughts are. And you're allowed to put your microphones on, by the way. This is back to you.
Jeg kan ikke zoome. Er det noen som kan zoome? Hvordan får jeg kameraet vårt? Det var det som var problemet. Ja.
Klasserommet, mikrofonen er på, og det er ingen innlinje på kamera. Men still spørsmål, kommenter.
Så tar jeg kakken nå. Jeg tror jeg nå.
Has everybody been reading everyone present been reading the paper? I suppose, you know, I'm quite happy to answer any questions or you know, also if you've got any ideas about how you might use some of these ideas in your own practice, in your own life, I'd be really interested.
I was just thinking about the relationship between capitalism and the way we organize our societies, and what Bateson would say about that, if you have any thoughts upon that. For example, or I could be more specific about how people seeking help are looked upon as numbers and not as persons, for example.
I think Bateson would be aghast at what he's seeing in the world, and particularly sort of the more toxic shape that capitalism is in at the moment. And Bateson was very respectful of other people's autonomy and integrity. He wouldn't coerce or try and control another human being. He might invite them to think differently, but he wouldn't want to force people to change. Equally, he would not want to treat people as numbers. Anything reductive would be absolutely antithetical to him. You know, to give somebody just a number. And I think that, you know, how we plan our work, we must be very careful to avoid sort of dualistic thinking. So why, in terms of, you know, I work privately, and I wouldn't turn clients away because of where they lived or the nature of their relationship. I assess people on their need. Do they need therapy? How urgently do they need therapy? What is it they want from therapy? Is it something that I can help them with, without any regard to them as individuals, their color, their race, their orientation? Makes no difference to me. What I'm more interested in is who they are and what their need is. And that can be tricky. You know, sometimes, but it's about treating people as human beings primarily. I don't know if that makes sense. But not, you know, it's not for me to make judgments about other people. Yes. Yeah.
I really liked the presentation. It is vital and very important. And I think when families come here, or couples, people come as, like me, I'm also a grandfather. I'm also extremely worried about and how we are affected by the war in Ukraine, the future, the COVID, I find myself not speaking very much about it. It's there, but it's not being a topic.
Yeah.
And what does all that does with families' lives? I remember I was listening to in the start of the war in Ukraine. I was treating myself with news for 2 hours, and that was the UN report came with how we treat our globe, and first hour was about the war, and I think it affects us all. Our worries. Also, for like, if you are a young couple with a child, how is this? Where will all the worries put you? Is it affect the bodies? And what is it? Is it fair to ask people what can you do in your life to manage to live in a way that you will, because I think the politicians is very much short terms. How can we get cheaper gasoline? How can we in Norway have enough food when all this is starting up? When we don't get the food from Ukraine and gasoline. So it's a very special situation at the moment. So how can we make this slip into our offices and in our conversation? I think it's a very important. Thank you.
Thank you ever so much for that. I think that this is the big dilemma. It's how do we promote the kind of change that we'd like to see without being coercive, without being controlling, without making people feel guilty too. It's a huge dilemma, and ordinarily I'm all for sort of just quietly getting on with life, but I actually genuinely believe that the time for quietly getting on with my life is over. I have a responsibility. I have to take risks. I have to risk becoming unpopular. I have to risk upsetting people by being true to what I believe. Because I genuinely believe that there's so much instability in the climate and in sort of geopolitically, it's that things could actually become much worse very, very quickly now. And it's urgent. So I haven't got all the answers. I'm asking questions. How do we do this? How do we do this as systemically minded people? Never mind the fact that we're therapists. That's kind of beside the point now. You know, we've been lucky enough to have the gift of being able to see the world differently and to be in the world differently. And it's a gift and it's a curse because it sets us apart. How do we ethically promote the kind of change that we want to see? And all I can say is, you know, for me, it's about trying to be the change in myself and trying to espouse the cybernetic epistemology that Bateson was telling us about. But, you know, I need to eat. I need to keep warm. I need to be in contact with people. You know, I can't just become a recluse and feel, you know, feel bad about things. So I have, you know, I'm trying to be an activist in ways that make sense, that work for my context and who I am. You know, I'm no Greta Thunberg, but I'm trying to do things in my way. So I'm very active on Twitter. I write. As a therapist, you know, I'm mindful. I do outdoor therapy with clients, but I'm not perfect. So yeah, so I think what you're saying is really important. There is a crisis. It's happening, and it could suddenly escalate catastrophically. So we need to be activists in ways that work for us. So, you know, you might choose one route, and you know, other people might do something else. But I think it's about sort of a lot of particularly in the UK, a lot of people they train as family therapists and they put their systemic hat on. They go into a clinic, they do some family therapy, and then they take the systemic hat off and go out. And I'm saying no, and we need to keep our systemic hats on all the time, even though sometimes it's hard work and it can make you feel lonely. What gives me hope is community, and I network with Andreas and other like-minded people, and I think that this is the future, is growing networks. And a bit like rhizomes that spread underground and then pop up in different places around the world. So there's people in Norway, there's people in Greece, there's people in Australia, in Ireland, in the UK. We're all trying to work together, and maybe that's one of the things that we can do. So I don't know if that helps. I'm going to have to leave in a few minutes, but I hope this has been useful.
Yeah. Can you hear us that's sitting in the big room? Can you hear?
I can just hear you. Yes.
Okay. There's a mic here. I'm just thinking about the word systemic. Like, I think I, in some ways, define myself as a systemic therapist, or that's like a foundation of the education as a family therapist. And the way I hear you is that you like, if maybe it's expanding the word in a way, or even if I think it means like everything has an impact on everything, or something like that. And I think it's important to create meaning around, about the word systemic, because it's like a word that's used a lot. But what does it really mean to us? And when you say that it thinks systemically about ourselves, I think that I always have been thinking systemically about myself, but not all the time, maybe. Like you say, and sometimes I can be quite dualistic as well. But it's like systemic, it's like a value. And in our context here at the office, to create a conversation about this, what does it mean, and what does it mean to us, and what could it mean, or what could it be in a therapeutic conversation? To kind of bring in the big picture in the conversations, or what kind of questions could we ask, or what could we bring into the conversation? Yeah, that's make me think about that. So yeah, there's many things to think about, many questions.
Yes. Yeah. Thank you for that. Yeah, I agree that there are far more questions than there are answers, for sure. It's when I was talking to a Dutch therapist this morning, and we were talking about the word trauma and how that's an overused word, and I think that there's a similar, but what trauma means, when it's psychological trauma, and you know why some people are resilient and some people aren't, and again it's another way of sort of chopping things up, ideas up. But I think with the word systemic, it's another word that perhaps has lost some of its meaning. I think it's a really interesting, you know, what does systemic actually mean? And it probably means different things to different people. You know, to a doctor, they talk about systemic drugs that work throughout the entire body. To a businessman, they think about systems in terms of logistics, transport, production, manufacture. To me, it's, you know, systems is about thinking about how everything is connected. Systems are simply subdivisions of the system. There is one system which is everything, and we chop it up necessarily because we wouldn't be able to function. We have to do that. We have to break things up into smaller pieces to understand them. Otherwise, we'd just be sitting, or, you know, we wouldn't be able to function. If we thought, you know, every time a family comes into the room, we think, well, you know, this mother and father and child, they're connected to the community, they're connected to the countryside, they're connected to the universe. It becomes less helpful to sort of zoom out to that extent, to do meaningful work with that family. Maybe we need to sort of focus in, but what we're focusing in on is down to us. But I kind of think that, you know, I go through life with you know, like lenses, and sometimes I need to zoom in on something, sometimes I need to zoom out. How far do I zoom out? But it's but for me, that's a useful kind of concept, is when do I need to sort of focus on details? When do I need to focus on a bigger picture? How big do I need to zoom out? So, but I try to be sort of as conscious of that as I can.
Thank you so much. Yeah.
Anything else?
I was just trying to mind your time. You're 3 minutes past.
Well, I'm assuming that most of you have given up your lunch break to be here. So thank you very much for giving me your time.
Thank you.
It's been a pleasure, and I know I'm looking forward to meeting some of you in a few weeks. So excellent, and thank you, Andres, for organising this.
Thank you.
Okay, so goodbye, and enjoy the rest of your day. Bye. Because I'm going to have to end it for everybody now.